You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG.
Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries, a podcast about Shadow Dark and sometimes other role-playing games where two GMs talk about their recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful that you can take to yours. On the show today, we discuss splitting the party. Hello there, sages and adventurers. My name's Jody, and with me, as always, is my good friend and GM colleague, Matt. How you doing?
Oh, doing well. We've
got our game on the last few weeks. We are back.
Indeed, we are back in a big way.
Good to be back at the table. So speaking of, today's episode is going to focus on something that happened in a game you were running a couple weeks ago at time of recording. So why don't you take us to the table?
Oh, indeed I will. So, Jody, we're back at the table for our Dolmenwood game. That is where we set this scene in the capital, or sort of the seat of power, Castle Brackenwold. And in the streets of Castle Brackenwold, just outside the walls to the inner city, we have a little altercation, a little encounter, you might say, where our fearless, and I mean that somewhat pejoratively in this sense, our fearless party sees a witch being dragged through the streets behind some guards and behind a horse. And as the party has become reasonably intertwined, we'll say, with the witch faction in Dolmenwood, they have some different reactions to this particular scene. And without going into too much detail, combat ensues. A little bit of an attempt to get this witch out of the situation that she was in through some clever trickery did not work, and we rolled initiative. And that is when the party realized there were two very high-level mages disguised as commoners following this particular procession, and that did not bode well for our self-titled greatest sorcerer in the world, who was very quickly manacled and gagged so she could not cast any spells, so was not able to evade capture. And as she was dragged away, the party disbanded with the crowd that had gathered and ended up having very different reactions to what to do next. And we ended up having the party split not one, not two, not three, but 4 different ways. Jody, your character skulking off into the darkness, or at least the shade of the alleyways. One party member ending up at a church, and the rest scattering, trying to tail this wizard. About an hour or two later, all the party members eventually reconvened at the only shared location that they all knew about.
All right. It was fantastic. And not touched on there in that moment was that was our opener. That's what we opened the session with. So that's actually where I want to begin our conversation around this today.
Sounds like a good place.
Let us begin at the beginning, controversial as it may be. So as the opener, to what degree was that scene planned to check certain boxes of coming back off a little bit of a hiatus? Yeah, what was your thought in that? Why start there? Why start with that scene? Because I think I could see a lot of things happening that I went like, oh, I see what you're doing there. Good move all around.
Well, okay, so here's the thing. What happened was at the end of the previous session, which we had taken about a month off, about 3.5, 4 weeks off between sessions. And so at the end of the last session, when you all arrived in Castle Brackenwold, in the largest city in Dolmenwood, I rolled a random encounter from a list of D6 random encounters, and it ended up being the one that you encountered. Jeez. Let's try harder here. Expand vocabulary, must. The thing that happened in the interim between the session that ended with that setup, right? That was kind of the dramatic cut, was you see this encounter and we'll start with it next time. Well, in the intervening weeks, you give a GM an opportunity to kind of iterate a little bit on a random encounter. You have this thing you know is going to happen, right? The Sly Flourish strong start that's kind of built into the in media res nature of this session's beginning. Well, the gears started turning, right? I started thinking about the context of our current narrative, which has very, very steeply or sharply diverged from the one that's set in Dolmenwood. So the world has changed irrevocably in many ways. And so without going into too much detail, essentially there's been a change in power and I thought what this scene could do would be to illustrate to all of you coming back to a city what has changed. Then do the classic D&D thing, do the classic RPG thing of just set up a scene and see what the players do.
There it was. And I felt like what was interesting about that question of, and see what the players do, set a scene, see what the players do, especially you bring up the Mike Shea quick start or, dynamic start or whatever you want to phrase of that you like, is there was definitely things about that scene. As you mentioned, our play group has both in-game an affinity for witches. That's one of the factions we've decided is maybe not terrible. Maybe. And then out of game, we have some folks who have a natural affinity for witches and witch-like things. And so there was a pull to that. So using a witch as the center. So was that the random, though? Was there's a witch being dragged through town just happened to be that one?
I mean, I'm struggling to remember exactly what the book said, but yeah, ostensibly that was the core conceit of the random encounter. And this is what I love about random encounters is sometimes they just feel like the exact thing that needs to happen. And so, I probably, I can almost say for sure, like I probably changed something. I probably changed the number of guards or whatever it is. But
right.
The core conceit was an encounter I rolled completely randomly. And when it came up and when I was delivering the setup at the end of that session, prior to the one that started with this encounter, I remember thinking that, we could probably play through that encounter and there were probably other places that we could stop, but I just felt like the setup would allow me to do a little bit of deepening of the situation, right? So I decided to stop the session prior to the encounter starting and didn't roll any reaction rolls, didn't do anything of that nature so that I could buy myself a little bit of time to really make it as meaningful, but also, frankly, as difficult as possible for the players. Like I wanted to be enticing, but in a way that was very clear that the stakes were either high or that there was more there than met the eye.
Right. And I think you did a great job of that because we entered the city under the guise of secrecy, that we have these like hidden assumed identities and turned a little Men in Black like, if you will, that we have these like we operate outside the law. But engaging with this meant engaging with the bureaucracy. So those stakes were immediately clear. I don't know if I've told you this story from my long distant past, and it occurs to me that one of the great things about TTRPGs is as a player, if you play it long enough, you actually get do-overs because certain tropes will represent themselves. Guards carrying away the potentially wrongly or maybe rightly accused villager, and do you intervene and save them? So many years ago, I was playing in a session that this more or less exact thing happened. There was a city guard or regional guard showed up. They captured somebody and was like, oh, this is the witch and we're going to burn her. And we as players could either intervene or not. And we elected not to, which if you had asked me 5 minutes into the scene you described and we played through, I would have thought the party was not going to react. Initially, our party was very hesitant to react. Now, what's interesting is we elected not to react. The guard actually burned the witch. Like they immediately burned her right there. And we were like, oh my God, that was terrible. It was like the first time we'd ever been in this town. And we're like, hey, we're not going to disrupt the whole town, but like, that's super messed up. But like, and the GM stopped the game and jewed us out. And this was not a good GM, and nor was it a group that I played with for a long time. But it was interesting being back in that moment with a party going, here's guards going, oh, we're going to take this witch, and genuinely thought, and I'll be honest, as a player, would have been in favor with, let them take her. That is not what we're here to do. Like, there is nothing about this scene that is what we're here to do. Now, the interesting part was in the old scene I described, and why I bothered telling it, is we as a party all agreed, like, yeah, we're not going to run out there and fight guards as low-level characters. We're not going to get in the middle of this city's bureaucracy. We're like, the stakes are not worth it here. And then watching our party, and it was fascinating because it felt like for a moment, everybody's going to let her go. And then all of a sudden, somebody sprang to action and like went and got involved. And then somebody else went and got involved. And then suddenly we're, as you said in your description, rolling initiative. And It was fascinating to me watching players interpret the scene differently or how to interact with the scene differently. And I remember you afterwards saying like, whoa, I didn't expect it to go that way. And I just thought this is where things started to diverge, was just in the moment watching players process through their character, which is rad. That's like what you want, right? Is that the players are processing through their characters, but they all process the scene so differently. I felt like when they were reacting, I was like, oh, you are seeing this very different than I am. And just curious, from the GM seat, did you feel like as the reactions to the guards began that you were like, oh, we're splitting this thing up, that we are bound for this is going to blow up?
Well, here's what it felt like to me. So we all know the kind of cliche of parties never retreat, right? So TPKs happen because somebody says we should leave now, and everyone goes, yeah, we should leave, and then no one leaves the combat, right? No, like,
right.
And or one person leaves and everybody else dies. This was that in reverse. So this was the okay, we're all basically on the same page that we are not going to do anything. We have been in this city for maybe 20, 30 minutes, and we have secret identities, and we have a specific goal in mind, and we are working for someone who's pretty powerful and who has sent us here to do a job. And we need to do that job, and if we start fussing around this quickly, then we might blow our cover, etc. Well, that just devolved very quickly for one player and then another, and it was a domino situation that I felt watching was the reverse cliche of retreating. Like, one person gets involved and everyone else feels like they need to support, and then suddenly, there's a big crowd of people, which there were some really interesting choices that were made, but they were all, in improv, you call it heightening, right? And you kind of reach a point in a scene where a scene's over because it's just so ridiculous and over the top that like you've heightened it so much that there's nowhere else to go. And that is what this scene felt like. We had a very smart idea to like whip up a crowd, to kind of create a commotion, to make sure that you guys could get into the city, into the inner city, and kind of follow and see where this witch was being taken. Great idea. Loved that. I thought that was going to be the scene.
Yeah, me too. Thought we were going to we're going to use this to get into the inner city. And then all of a sudden we weren't.
And then suddenly somebody was like, well, if I have a distraction, I could maybe cast a spell. And then when that spell didn't work out, and we rolled to see if the guards were wise to it, and they were, a couple of them, suddenly then we have this like, well, now they know that one of you in the party has been fussing with this situation. Nobody else need do anything. And then, we had combat. So what I felt, and maybe you can tell me if you think this was the case, what I loved about this scene, and we'll get to the splitting the party in a moment, because I think this is the kernel from which the splitting of the party springs. But this combat encounter, this is what I love about old school games and the old school mentality, right? Is if this was a 5th edition game or any other kind of heroic fantasy game with lots of mechanics for combat, it would have been hard for players not to immediately do that. Do you feel like that is true? Because Shadowed Ark is kind of steeped in that OSR vibe. Do you feel like that affected the scene?
Oh, undeniably. This is an area where the argument that frankly at this point I feel like is a bad faith argument, or it is a person speaking from just no frame of actual understanding. When people say things like, oh, modern D&D, 5e and beyond, there's only rules for combat, so it's a game that's only about combat. I'm like, what are you talking about? Because frankly, there's so many rules for non-combat that it also causes problems, because we would have been bogged down in like, well, I want to make a perception check. Well, I want to make an investigation check. Well, I want to make, so not only that, but also you have so many ways to deal with crowd control and so many ways to, whereas the number of ways that you can affect a large group or interact with a largely public scene just on a mechanical level is a huge limiting factor. There are 6 players in this group, and we went, it's 4 guards with a witch, and we didn't know about the 2 mages in the crowd, which was a beautiful twist, by the way. That is will now become cliche in my things of like, oh, these guards are transporting a magic user. They then would need a magic user. I mean, it's just like one of those common sense, aha, but I'd never seen it before. I thought it was dope. But how do you deal with 6 people? It's going to be 6 on 6 in the town, and there's other guards around, and there's the crowd, and they're like, that heightening of stakes just on numbers is an OSR or rules light, frankly, thing that just makes scenes like that sing, that get so bogged down and clunky in more rules heavy systems. And so for the new school, old school, for me, I see it as just a rules light thing of, if there aren't rules there, or there isn't a way to have like, I can attack 5 or 6 of these guys at once, there's not a good answer. It's just an unsolvable problem.
Well, I mean, you could throw a fireball at it, but I think
that's the problem now.
But that is to maybe, I don't know. I don't want to belabor this point, but I think like, the problem, quote unquote problem, because I think there's a way to build this scene in 5th edition and make it fun and all that. So,
sure.
So, but the way that I and we like to play with a more, the narrative kind of is born out of the choices the players make, and we're not going from like one encounter to another combat encounter, etc. I think this scene was a great study in both players being able to just make choices freely. And also, on my end, knowing some things about the encounter, specifically that there were 2 very high-level mages who were just parts of the crowd who were there in case this kind of thing happened. That was something that I was ready to just let go and never, that's one of those things as a GM, well, my players may never know how clever I am.
Right.
But you just have to like do this. And it ended up being that it was a factor. But I just think that in a situation like this, there is also the fact that I built this encounter. It was a built encounter. It was an encounter that was at first generative, but that I spent a while thinking about. And I didn't necessarily plan how it would go, but I planned a story around it. It became a set piece encounter, unlike what it would have been if we had played through it at the end of the session. And so on my side of the table, so to speak, I just think it's really interesting what happens when a random generative encounter goes from that to something that's much more heavily planned. And what it did was it allowed me to deepen the potential if you guys deepen the narrative potential if you guys ended up actually engaging with it, without doing a ton more work. But I just think in the OSR and in the kind of the conversations, there is a little bit of a tendency to stray away from planned and prepped encounters altogether. And I just think like this was a great example of, the whatever you want to call it, like prepping scenarios or situations, not stories or whatever. But there was a story here. And so, taking a page out of your book to infuse the scene with story and have there be some purpose for it. There was a purpose behind the scene, and that ended up making it more meaningful, I think, to engage with.
100%. And that's why there was this, and the beauty of it was we genuinely could have just let it walk by
100%,
and none of it would have played out. It would have been an interesting color blip and we would have moved on. Speaking of moving on,
here, let's get to the meat.
So the traditional wisdom of ages past, if you are a player, is do not split the party.
Indeed.
This party then, as soon as initiative was rolled, we were split.
Yep.
Like literally we rolled initiative and people didn't drop into combat rounds. I mean, we were working through the table in combat rounds because we roll an individual. We both run with individualized initiative rather than the traditional Shadow Dark start with the high player. I keep telling myself at some point I'm going to play as written in Shadow Dark and I just never do. But someday I will. But as a player, I was like, oh my gosh, the first round of combat has started and nobody's jumping into and we're going to start stabbing people or blowing things up. People continued with the narrative just in encounter rounds. And I could see pretty quickly, and this is why I wanted to do all that background discussion also, was I could see, we're splitting. Like this, we are not going to approach this combat the same. As somewhat veteran player, I also realized the stakes just went way up. Because if not everybody's on the same page, you mentioned TPK earlier, this is another classic TPK scenario as we go into a combat where players are approaching the scene differently. So I thought it was really fun and interesting to watch a combat unfold where one person is giving themselves over to the guards, somebody else is trying to free the guards, or not free the guards, free the witch, somebody else is trying to interact with the crowd. One player just full on has analysis paralysis and locked up and didn't know what to do. And somebody else was somewhere in between. Like it was immediately split in terms of actions. And I felt like you handled it really well. So as a GM, when you saw that we're not going to full nuclear solutions immediately like players often do, we're still trying to be a little bit tactful. How did that shift your mindset about judging, arbitrating, refereeing that scene as it unfolded once it turned into okay, there could be stabbing and blowing up and these mages have revealed themselves. Some of the players are putting themselves in harm's way, and some are literally running away from harm. Which is what the player who wasn't sure what to do, actually pulled out and started
running,
bailing. Which was fascinating to me. So how that's really, because trying to really put this succinctly, and I have already failed. The wisdom for players is do not split the party. And I'll be honest, as a GM, I don't love when the party splits up. It's always fun, but it's also a little bit of a headache. And as you mentioned in your description, the party split 5 different directions out of 6 players. But you handled it really smoothly. So was there a panic for you, or you were like, no, I got this. I'm used to you guys being knuckleheads. And
yeah, no, I'm used to it. and so here's the thing. It is 2 things. First of all, I think the don't split the party mentality has been, talked to death. So I don't really want to argue or no, not argue, but I don't really want to debate the merits of splitting the party. I think it's fine. I think, whatever. It is a part of the game that sometimes comes up, and when the party needs to be split and people don't split it because of this mantra or because they don't think that they should, that kind of bums me out. So in this case, the party, I don't know if they needed to split, but everyone was on different pages about what to do, and so it happened. So first of all, what I really respected was the fact that and this comes from, I think, a level of trust that I have built with the table. The player who initiated the combat by attempting to cast a spell, an 8th level wizard, was manacled and gagged after having hold person cast on them. And I basically said, look, you cannot cast spells and you have 2 reasonably strong people holding you. Unless your party gets involved, you are as good as, you can't cast spells. You don't have any way out, unless you can think of something creative. And that player basically, I think because she knew that it was an interesting narrative beat, basically said, that's fine, and continued to role play through it, but with the assumption that she was going to be captured and thrown into the dungeon, right? So that alone, as a centerpiece for the combat, was wonderful because it gave the whole scene something to focus on. And so when everyone else was splitting up and you were running into an alley and trying to hide, and we had people retreating, we had somebody kind of like trying to use the crowd to their advantage. I like having a focal point for whatever the party is split around. The hardest parts of splitting the party are when the party splits up and is doing two completely different things that have no relationship to one another. One party is going and looking for treasure. The other party wants to go fight this monster. That's the worst possible scenario, right? Because then you're maybe if you're in combat rounds with one group and not, it's absolute nonsense. But in this case, because everyone was in the same space but interested in doing other things, I could constantly come back to the guards say something or these mages say something, and that gave the scene a center point upon which everyone else could kind of decide what they wanted to do. And so, no, I wasn't particularly. This happens so much that our group just kind of throws crazy crap my way. That I maybe it's just like an athlete that's trained for it. In a strange, very specific, narrow sense. I have trained for this moment.
Okay, so let's zoom in a smidge more.
Yeah.
So one of the players though really didn't know what to do. One of our players, legitimately took a good, long, hard look at their character sheet, which for me in Shadow Dark is always a like, as a GM, it's an uh-oh. Like if I'm GMing and I get to a player's turn and they are like really digging into their character sheet, I'm like, good, I've given them an interesting puzzle, or bad, they're lost. Like they're lost. And I don't know which this was for this player. If it was an interesting puzzle, or they just were like, I am in a situation where I have no choices to make, right? Yeah. And that's when a player's lost and they feel like, I don't have any choices to make. That sucks. And like as a player, when you're like, I don't know. And this leads to, one of those kind of famous GMing player interactions of the player looks at GM and goes, well, I don't know what you want me to do. And it's like, well, there's a great, Colville quote about, I want you to imagine the world complexly. But sometimes as a player, you can be in a situation where you're just like, I could flip a coin, I guess. Like, yeah. So it was interesting, again, watching that there was one player who seemed to be at that point of not frustration in any way, but genuinely was just totally at a loss. Whereas others of us were trying, to control certain narrative aspects of going back to the central scene. For me, that's panic's too strong of a word, but I have to really fight the urge to like help that person along. And just curious, what was your approach in that? Or did you see it? I mean, maybe this is...
yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know. I hope this doesn't come off callous, but I don't care. And this is not, it's not, I don't care in the sense that I don't care if this player is having fun or whatever. Here's the long and short of it though. There is a certain point where it's no longer your problem, right? As a GM. And, this is one of those places you have to be very careful not to blame the player, right? I'm not blaming the player here. What I'm saying is maybe there was some extenuating circumstance. We play on Friday evenings. Sometimes people are tired. Whatever it is, right? Might be some.
My kid out of texted me between my player turns, and I lost a beat.
Right, and so I don't know what it was.
Right,
when you have a group like this one that has been playing together for over 4 years now, and I have built, like I said, and this is actually kind of why I prefaced this whole conversation with or started this whole conversation talking about our wizard and this kind of trust that I feel like I've built with players, that your decisions will bear fruit. If you take big swings, something interesting is going to happen, and the story will move forward. And I'm not going to kill your character in a cutscene or something like that, right? You will have agency. So all that said, when this player didn't know what to do and said, I'm going to run, I tried to the best of my ability to very clearly establish that this character had kind of was paralyzed and then was like, I'm out of here. And I think that ended up actually being the thing that changed the way the whole party thought about the combat.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I said I don't care, is because if it's natural and organic and it happens and we all take it as what it is meant to be, which is that this player and their character are struggling with the moment, that is what it is. There's no need to make it anything else. The only thing that I ever have a problem with is when we're not snapping through player turns.
Right.
And that happened a couple times, but not to the degree that I felt like it was detrimental to the combat. And I felt like it lended a little bit more stakes because it was symbolic of this player and this character really taking the scene seriously. When I become worried, you said that you kind of become worried. I get worried, but I don't really do anything anymore because this group has been playing together for so long, and I can always check in with people after the game because I know there's going to be another one.
So moving on from the person who was stuck, in contrast, we had other players who were taking varying degrees of big swings.
Sure.
Giving over self to be captured. My sneaking was to outflank and do thiefy things, and I can still trail the party or trail the guards when they take the other elf away. I can track them where other people might be obvious about it because they're not thieves. And then somebody ended up at a temple, started wandering off down the streets and got lost in it. So talk about then honoring as the splash pool of player choice, and the party is splitting and the puddle is getting bigger and bigger, and then honoring those choices. You alluded to the choices will bear fruit. Talk a little bit about how much fruit to bear, right? Because there is a problem of the never-ending buffet, and we never come back together.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and get through this as quickly as possible. First things first. As soon as the combat ends and everyone decides to go a different direction, then I have a choice to make. It's like, how do I do this? And I love a very, 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 very super simple skill challenge or something to that nature, where I'm going to say, everybody choose a stat and tell me how you're using it. And we're going to go around and I'll assign DCs or whatever. And this isn't really a skill challenge, but what I like is when I throw it back to the players and I say, okay, you guys are all doing different things here. Or you're all trying to do the same thing, but it's a very complicated aspect. And in fact, Jody, you did this in a game that we just played this past Saturday when we were trying to build a boat, which we did on a couple of natural 20s.
And it turns out building a boat's really easy,
dude. When you're a shipwright like my dwarf was,
that was
and still
insane.
That raft was. And if you take that raft from us, there will be hell to pay. But but here's the thing: is that I like making sure that the players have an opportunity to do the things that they're good at and leverage the stats that they have, good modifiers in. But I want them to do it narratively. So tell me how you're going to use it. And we did that. And from that whip around the table, that round following combat where everyone, we spend a round, basically a crawling round in this case, because we're kind of slowing things down and things are dangerous and the combat just ended and things are chaotic as well. That gave me a sense of okay, what is everyone doing? And if people failed, that meant that they might get further splits. So this character that was attempting to find a path to the main gate to the ducal keep and the dungeons. Well, it's that's going to be an easy intelligence check. You've been here before, but maybe not been into this place for a while. Easy intelligence check. Well, when you have a -4 intelligence, Jody, this is not going to be easy to do.
Yeah.
And this player and character, we've sort of been playing up his lack of intelligence, and there's a reason for it. There's a narrative reason that we're sort of getting and uncovering. Long story short, he wanders into a church and is met with like an apocalyptic priest and whatnot. And that scene was purely for flavor. And it was an example, as you said, of giving a little bit of, you didn't give me much. You just said you wanted to like go find this place and you failed your role. Well, let's give that a little bit of like something, right? But we don't need to make it an extended scene. One player wanted to go find a rumor, and she got a slightly extended scene with like a salesperson of some dish. I can't remember. I think it was a calamari salesperson or something like that.
I forgot all about the calamari salesman. That's right.
And so here's me being very verbose about verbose, but what I think is important when players tell you that they want to do something is I like to wrap everything in the form of a scene, even if it's a short scene. Give them an NPC, give them part of the world. I hate, and I say hate, and I'm probably using this, I do not like delivering information to players as much as possible by just telling them this is what you heard, or this is what you know, or whatever. I like delivering it through the world. Mm-hmm. If you want to learn something about the world, then the world is going to tell you about itself, whether that's through a language or graffiti, that's symbols, or that's the weather or some omen. Like, the world is going to tell you something about it. And that's the way I adjudicated those scenes, was if you gave me something to work with, I was going to try and let the world give you something back.
Yeah, and I think it worked out, and your instinct. In fact, it was funny, as you were talking about that, I was thinking back to, you mentioned this group's been together for 4+ years now, and some early sessions we played, and that ball of yarn, if you will, of story, and that each person's pulling a different thread for a moment, kind of unwinding. That we are off in the weeds and doing different things, and and I think there is your sense of like, no, I've trained for this, comedic as that was in an analogous sense to an athlete. There is some truth to that, of you just develop a feel for, I'm going to honor players' choice and give them a snapshot of the world, but I'm also going to pull them back in to this focal point, or I'm going to, I can't remember off the top of my head. There is a Shadow Dark rule for this of time passes.
It's time passes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That I give players to put something concrete, because it's not helpful to be like, I just give people, this is very esoteric. And I've been very esoteric talking about this. I'm going to try and be a little bit more concrete. I usually will give 5 minutes to a scene if the party is split. And depending on how interesting it is to the other players. Because if it's information that I know everyone wants, I can spend a little longer on it, right? Like, I can deliver the information in character extemporaneously as an NPC. And if everybody around the table wants that same information, then I know that all the players are going to be invested for a little bit longer. If nobody else is really interested in the rumor or the conversation, then, does anyone really want to listen to an apocalyptic preacher in this particular play group? You guys really do not like the central religious church of this world. No one wants to hear this, so I'm going to do it just enough to annoy everyone, and then we're going to move on.
Right.
So that's kind of my metric is, I tend to be very hyper vigilant about time, and I don't always get it right, but that's kind of when I say I've trained for this, that's the kind of stuff I've trained, is to have a heuristic for about how long has this been lasting. And I try and make it about that 5 minutes, because at that point we time out.
Is that cumulative 5 minutes or per cut?
I will go,
I mean,
depends.
I also want to be clear. I understand you're saying this because I know you well, but if a listener's in there, it's not like you have a 5-minute timer going. No. It feels like about 5 discussion beats.
Yeah.
And then each one of those about a minute long and then next and next and next.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go, again, this is all heuristics and it's all kind of wishy-washy, but I will engage depending on the number of players in a particular group that has been split. If there's 2 players, I'll give them, more time. If there's 1 player, I'll give them less. But usually about 5 minutes of a scene is the absolute max. If you can do it in less while the party is split, great. And my recommendation is always, and the thing that I find very, very, very useful is the cut. And literally saying, we cut from that scene to this scene, right? And I have found that verbalizing it makes it so that we don't just randomly cut away and say something like, well, now we're going to go over here. We actually cut, and that gives it a dramatic beat. And I usually will try and do it at a place of reasonably high drama. I don't want to deprive the player of a moment, but I also, want it to be something they're thinking about. So if there's a question that an NPC asks them that is going to take them a while to maybe check their notes, we're going to cut from there, and I'm going to go to a different scene. They can check their notes, etc. Mm-hmm. And so that is a skill that I have learned because you guys are 6 players who drive me absolutely bonkers every single game, and
we certainly try our best.
Well, I'm committed to this very open worldy feeling game, and what happens is that you all know this because you guys will test me I can see it.
Well, this brings me to my next thing I want to ask you about. So here's your curveball for the discussion as we're winding down here. So you've given us all these 5 minutes. We all come back together. You do just as you described. I think one of the last beats was like, my thief is like, okay, I have a sense of where they're going. I'm going to cruise out this side alley, and like walks out because he's an idiot right between 2 guards. A little quick role play. He Bob's your uncle. High five, buddy. Thanks for directions. I gotta go. And scampers off back into the flurry of the streets. And we reconvene outside the tavern where the whole thing started. And we go in and we start the new scene and we move forward. Cut to next week. And we're walking into a very private hidden garden.
Yeah.
And we know we need to search this garden for 4 separate little shacks.
Mm-hmm.
And we get in. And at one point, very quickly, it was just a 3 or 4 round, but literally the players are chanting, split the party.
Yeah.
So to kind of close us out of your advice has encouraged a behavior of splitting the party. Yeah. Any thoughts on that particular scene? And then the fact that the player group was like, split the party. And I had already gone off on my own at this point. So clearly I'm no better than the rest. I mean, I think I know the GM answer for me, but I'm just curious, how did that land for you in light of this conversation that the next week there was a chant to split the party?
Yeah, so look, I call it faux antagonism. That's the way I think about it. I am a fairly faux antagonist GM. Like I will purposefully antagonize players, not their characters, but their players. Also their characters,
Yeah, we've seen, not in a while, and thank you, but we went through a route of Chads.
Yeah, I will put NPCs in the game that I know are personalities that people do not like, I want to be very clear that this is not me trying to be a jerk. What it is me basically telling players, "Hey, I see you."
Right.
And here's something that I know will make you annoyed, like a witch being dragged. I mean, that was a serendipitous thing, but I knew as soon as I rolled that encounter up, some of these players they're going to have strong reactions, and they're going to probably try and backwards design their characters into getting involved.
One of our players, and I was curious, actually, you didn't talk about this when I asked you about the designing piece, but one of our players, as a person, the player, is just incredibly kind, is like just one of the most kind-hearted people you will ever meet. And I was like watching this scene and I was like, this is going to just be brutal for her to let this person.
Yeah.
and there isn't a witch alignment there,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no way she's going to be able to let that go. And she almost did, and then couldn't. So, but yeah, so this faux antagonism, I like that phrasing. This, and I think of it as just bantering with your friends. It's like, hey,
Sure.
we're you and I, once upon a once, you certainly more recently than I, we're engaged in athletics, and the trash talking is a fun part of athletics. And
100%.
I love that. I enjoy a little bit of banter and snark, or a lot of banter and snark. So with all that said, how did that land then to get back to the split the party?
So I love that stuff. And I think that's a table culture thing. And I think that maybe there's something here that I'm realizing in this moment, that like splitting the party is the reason there's a mantra about it is because there was a table culture that like quote unquote won the debate. Right. And that table culture was one of chaos and players probably trying to, I don't know what it was. I don't actually want to speculate, but I speculate that there was, I'm going to do it anyways, but I speculate that there were GMs who, were very adversarial, and there were players who were very adversarial. And so when they would split the party, the GM would say, whoop, you shouldn't do that, and here's a dragon, right? And the dragon bites off your heads, and then these other two guys fall down a pit trap, and everybody dies. So for me, when the party is split, I don't do anything differently. I just run the game at the normal level of, quote unquote challenge. There's lots of transparent ways that we adjudicate random encounters, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't even worry about it. I just continue running. And, you guys know that your folly will come back to bite you in the butt. Like, this is the thing that you have realized. And the best part about that fight where there were two wizards who were clandestinely placed in the crowd is that everyone went, oh, yeah, of course. Like, of course they're not just transporting this dangerous person with just a couple of knucklehead guards.
Yeah. Two normie jabronis aren't dragging back a spellcaster. They're going to need somebody else who can cast spells around.
And that's the kind of stuff where I go, all right, well then I've done my job, because there is a point at which the reality of the world makes sense and bites characters in the butt. And that, I think, is also something that can potentially be hard to pull off in 5th edition, because players oftentimes have tools to get themselves out of bad decisions or get themselves out of situations that should probably, not for any other reason except it would be interesting dramatically, be quote unquote punished. Like, you made a decision that was not the most optimal decision. In 5th edition and other heroic fantasy games, you have a lot of tools to get out of jail free. And in this instance, quite literally.
Yeah.
In Shadowdark, and this is why I love the fact that there are no saving throws in Shadowdark, hold person just works. Because if there's nobody else in the party who can dispel that spell, it is just, that's it, man. And that was what happened. And in the aftermath of that, when you guys were exploring this, as you said, you guys are exploring this garden looking for a secret entrance to go save this PC, the way that I quote unquote rewarded this player for their big swing was when they said, hey, can my player character be the witch that got away? Of course, I'm going to say yes. This player loves witches, and it was the literal least I could do to give them an opportunity to play the witch class, what they've wanted to play forever. And they played very briefly at the beginning of the campaign before I took it off the table retroactively, because we hadn't gotten there in the narrative yet. Now you guys have this new party member who's a witch and who is likely only going to be around for this short part of the story, but it's great. And this is the second time that this high-level caster has been sequestered in a narrative prison, literally and figuratively.
She has a hard time staying out of jail. That notion of rewarding the player for taking the big swing, and I think what I was alluding to is and also very common if you believe the discussion of the internet and forums and age-old forums. I mean, we can also go back to literal letter writing from the 70s of the antagonistic GM, is first and foremost reward that player agency, but then let the world punish the bad behavior if the players are taking advantage. And our chant of split the party was not taking advantage. There was an actual need to split the party there.
Yeah.
Like there was a legitimate reason for like, no, spread out. We have a limited time and a lot of area to cover. But again, both rewarding and air quotes, and I'm using this very lightly, punishing the party because the world says so. Mm-hmm. And that witch showing up as the new player character for the wizard who got captured not only was like a nice nod to that player, but also made so why is this new character randomly showing up on this like incredibly crucial mission? There's the answer, because they just got bailed out by our party from going to jail, and they feel indebted to us because otherwise they'd be rotting in a jail. So thumbs up, here we go. No awkward, you meet in a tavern and I have silver eyes. Then like we just move on, and it's been great. It's been superb. So let's go ahead and wrap this discussion. Let's have a quick word from a sponsor and come back with hopefully something concrete.
Dungeon Master Diaries is brought to you by Tuber Eats, the halfling meal delivery service, Jody. You know, if it's been a long day and you're tired, you know what that feels like. God, you look awful. You've been crawling around in the dark, cheating death and discovering massive treasure hoards, or pissing off the town guards. Do you really have time to cook? Of course not. And you don't have to, because with Tuber Eats, you can have a delicious second breakfast brought right to your doorstep. Jody, talk to me a little bit about your most recent experience with Tuber Eats.
So a while back, I mentioned that I had been dabbling with one of our other sponsors, and I learned to cast a little spell or two. It turns out that people know when you cast spells on them, and I'm really tired of doing all of the cooking in light of my questionable choices of using spells on my wife. Let me just say, Tuber Eats has really bailed me out over the last few nights.
Jody, you are experiencing the best meal delivery service out there, and it shows, because they don't just deliver the food, they make it fresh to order. Now, what is your favorite thing? Let me rattle a few of these things off. You tell me what you have enjoyed recently. Maybe it's their savory meat pies, their honey cakes, their roasted rooster, their dumpling soup, or their specialty, Raylina's ale stew with ruby red tomatoes. Have you had any or all of these delicious meals?
Well, my rooster was roasted, but that ale stew was a game changer. I think 2 or 3 more months, and she might just forgive me for casting that spell on her.
This is why we partner with Tuber Eats. It is the best and most affordable meal delivery service out there, so you can get food delivered with no minimum order. Did you smoke a little bit too much pipe leaf today, or cast a spell on your unsuspecting wife? Well, if you have a hankering for something tasty, or you need something tasty, just use the code DMD when you order to get 10% off your first order. That's Tuber Eats. Tasty eats, hairy feats.
All right, we are back. Thank you to our sponsors. Let us bring this topic into the light. All right, Matt, kick us off. What's your core takeaway from this discussion?
All right, so my first one is cut. Create drama without stealing the moment. If you are experiencing a party split, whether that's kind of the way that it happened here, kind of organically out of a combat, or in a dungeon, or wherever, this could be applied to lots of different situations where the party members have disbanded into different groups. I love cutting at dramatically appropriate moments and beats from one player or their character or group of characters to another.
Absolutely. You know, and this is my first takeaway, is because there's such a rich chance for story, you can move the story forward literally multiple times faster because you have multiple groups, but you have to mind the pacing in these. Oh my goodness, that cut is so valuable that you just gave of. It's so easy to lose threads or latch on to threads. If you are in a split party situation, just careful with your pacing there. Try and really get around the table. Lean into the Shadow Dark always on initiative.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm just going to tag onto that, Jody, that it is a learned skill, and when we don't allow parties to be split, it is a skill that we can't develop. So reward those party splits, and, Jody, reward players taking big swings. I think all too often players are worried about their characters' lives, or they're worried about doing something wrong, and so they stay away from taking big swings, like allowing their character, who is a high-level wizard, to be captured. I mean, that is something that is narratively satisfying, but is hard to do as a player, to let that character go and not know if your GM, is going to do something to them off screen that might affect the way that you experience that character the next time you actually get to play off their sheet. So rewarding those big swings and rewarding player agency, but also, as you said, Jody, punishing them if need be.
And that's my closeout, man, is hey, GMs, don't punish player choice. We never will. I can't imagine a situation where we would condone antagonistic GMing and actively punishing our players, but we are totally in favor of the world doing it. If they make weird choices and they split up and they're like, 6 different giant beholders attacking us, let us separate and attack them. The beholders can kill them. That's fine. The beholders are allowed to
Jody,
do that.
I don't know what a beholder is. I've never heard of this beholder before.
They're from a different plane of reality. Yeah, so to put that short and sweet, don't punish your players' choices. Let the world do it. As the torchlight grows dim, we hope you were able to find something useful in this discussion today that you can take into one of your future games. If you have any questions or unique experiences from your table that you'd like us to discuss in a future episode, you can email us now at dmdiariespod@gmail.com. You can also reach out to us via YouTube or Facebook, or best of all, on Dungeon Master Diaries thread on the Shadow Dark Discord channel. You can find links to those feeds and any other materials we referenced today in this show's show notes. Until next time, may your tavern be light and your shadows be dark.
Oh, a new one. Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network, and it is produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by me, Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster, and Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production, is not affiliated with the Arcane Library, LLC. Shadow Dark RPG is a product of the Arcane Library. Copyrights 2023.